Close your eyes for a second and think of the first video game you truly loved. Maybe it was guiding a tiny plumber through a maze of pixelated pipes, piloting a starship through a sea of enemies, or quietly tending to a village on your phone at 2 a.m., promising yourself just one more level. Whatever it was, that game wasn't just software. It was a doorway into challenge, creativity, and worlds that existed only because someone, somewhere, dared to imagine them. Today, we're going to trace the journey behind those worlds, from blinking lights in research labs to the vast, shared universes millions of people explore today. This is the story of how video games evolved into one of the most powerful storytelling mediums on Earth. It begins long before consoles, cartridges, or download buttons in the 1950s and 1960s inside quiet research labs and universities. Back then, computers filled entire rooms. They were rare, expensive, and slow. No one bought them to have fun. They were for science, defense, and serious calculations. But wherever you find complex machines, you also find curious humans. In 1952, a researcher at the University of Cambridge created a simple game of digital tic-tac-toe, one of the earliest known examples of a computer game displayed on a screen. A few years later, in 1958, physicist William Higginbotham built Tennis for Two on an oscilloscope display, two glowing dots batting a line of light back and forth. It wasn't sold, packaged, or branded. It was just a clever demonstration and an early hint of what was possible. Then, in 1962, in a lab at MIT, a small group of students created something that feels surprisingly modern: Spacewar. Two tiny ships, a star in the middle, and gravity pulling everything toward disaster. Players dogfought across a black and white screen, dodging the star and trying not to spin out into oblivion. It was hard, fast, and purely for fun. They didn't make money from Spacewar, but they did something more important. They spread the code. Wherever a compatible computer existed, people copied, modified, and expanded it. Without realizing it, they planted the seed of a culture of sharing, tinkering, and play that would define video games for decades to come. These early creations mark the true beginning of the evolution of video games, long before the industry had a name. If Spacewar was a spark, the early 1970s were gasoline. In 1972, an engineer named Ralph Baer, often considered the father of video games, helped create a device that could plug into an ordinary television and let people play simple games at home. It became the Magnavox Odyssey, widely recognized as the first commercial home video game console. It was primitive by today's standards. Plastic overlays on the TV screen, basic paddles, and simple dots of light. But for the first time, families could bring interactive entertainment into their living rooms. That same year, another landmark arrived in a different setting: the arcade. Atari's Pong took the idea of simple table tennis and turned it into a coin-operated sensation. A white square, ball, two paddles, and a satisfying beep every time you scored. The concept could not have been simpler or more addictive. Cabinets appeared in bars, bowling alleys, and arcades. Legend has it that the first test machine broke down not because of a bug, but because it was overflowing with quarters. From there, the arcade age exploded. Space Invaders marched onto the scene, followed by Pac-Man, Donkey Kong, Galaga, and a growing army of pixelated icons. Teenagers lined up with pockets full of coins. High scores became a kind of neighborhood legend. Games were still simple shapes on a screen, but the emotions were already huge. Pride, frustration, laughter, competition, and that delicious feeling of just one more try. This era remains one of the most iconic chapters in classic video game history. As with many great stories, the early success of video games led to a dangerous temptation: more. By the early 1980s, the home console market in North America was crowded. Multiple systems competed for attention. Game cartridges piled up on store shelves, many rushed, buggy, or simply not fun. In 1983, the industry in the United States hit a wall. Sales collapsed. Unsold games sat in warehouses and bargain bins. For a moment, it looked like video games might end up remembered as a short-lived fad. Many historians consider this crash a defining turning point in the history of video games. But the story was far from over. Across the Pacific, a company in Japan was quietly preparing a different approach, one rooted in tighter quality control, polished game design, and characters players would fall in love with. In 1983, Nintendo released the Famicom in Japan. 2 years later, in 1985, a redesigned version arrived in North America as the Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES. Instead of treating games as throwaway products, Nintendo treated them almost like interactive toys and stories. Super Mario Bros., The Legend of Zelda, Metroid, these weren't just games. They were adventures people talked about on playgrounds and remembered for life. Cartridge by cartridge, level by level, the NES helped restore trust in video games. The medium had survived its first great crash and come back stronger. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, video games had moved from novelty to cultural force, and competition pushed innovation even further. On one side, Nintendo continued to refine its formula with the Super Nintendo, bringing richer colors, deeper soundtracks, and bigger worlds. On the other side, Sega charged into the living room with the Genesis, proudly advertising that Genesis does what Nintendo don't. The so-called console wars were born, and living rooms turned into friendly battlegrounds. Was Sonic faster than Mario? Which console had the better sports games, the cooler mascots, or the most impressive graphics? These debates weren't just marketing, they were part of growing up. At the same time, another revolution was brewing on desks and in offices: the personal computer. PCs offered something consoles couldn't: flexibility. Players discovered flight simulators, strategy epics, dungeon crawlers, and first-person shooters that took full advantage of keyboards, mice, and rapidly improving hardware. Games like Doom, Warcraft, and countless shareware titles spread through discs and later, downloads. LAN parties, groups of friends connecting their computers together, turned garages and basements into makeshift networks. If you ever remember tripping over an Ethernet cable on the floor, you were there. Two paths were emerging: the curated, plug-and-play world of consoles and the endlessly customizable frontier of PC gaming. Together, they pushed the medium forward, each influencing the other and shaping the modern era of play. As the 1990s progressed, a simple truth emerged. Players didn't just want more games, they wanted bigger worlds. New consoles like the Sony PlayStation and the Nintendo 64 brought true 3D graphics into the mainstream. Suddenly, our heroes weren't flat sprites sliding across a screen. They could run, jump, and explore in 3 dimensions. Super Mario 64 invited players into open, explorable levels full of secrets. Final Fantasy VII blended cinematic storytelling with interactive adventure. Gran Turismo turned racing into a detailed simulation, and countless other titles experimented with camera angles, voice acting, and memory cards filled with save files. The shift to 3D is often cited as one of the most important moments in the evolution of video games. Video games weren't just competing with each other anymore. They were competing with movies, books, and television, and often winning because they offered something unique: the chance to participate. Meanwhile, the internet was quietly laying down cables that would change everything again. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, multiplayer began to mean something new. Instead of passing a controller back and forth on the couch, players could now connect across town, across countries, and eventually across the planet. Online games and massive virtual worlds appeared, from early online shooters to sprawling MMORPGs, where thousands of players shared the same digital space. Guilds, clans, and online friendships formed, some lasting for years, some even crossing over into real-world relationships and families. Online gaming history accelerated rapidly during this time, redefining how players interacted. Then, almost quietly at first, another wave arrived in the late 2000s: mobile gaming. There had been simple games on older mobile phones before, but smartphones and app stores suddenly brought gaming to millions of new players. In waiting rooms, on buses, during lunch breaks, games were now everywhere. At the same time, one more shift was happening. People weren't just playing games, they were watching them. Streaming platforms and content creators turned gameplay into a form of entertainment all its own. Speedrunners, competitive players, and storytellers who used games as their stage built enormous audiences. Esports arenas filled with cheering fans, and tournaments reached prize pools that would have seemed impossible a decade earlier. Video games had gone from a niche hobby to a global culture, a shared language spoken in pixels, polygons, and ping times. So where are we now? Today, video games are created by teams around the world. Artists, programmers, designers, musicians, and writers working together to build experiences that can be shared by millions. But despite all the advances in technology, one thing hasn't changed since the days of Spacewar and Pong. Every game still begins with a human spark, someone asking a simple question: what if? What if I could explore another world? What if my choices mattered? What if I could explore a fantasy world with my friends? Those questions have carried video games from experimental lab projects to one of the most influential creative mediums in history. From glowing dots on an oscilloscope to vast virtual worlds, the history of video games is a story of imagination meeting technology again and again. It's a journey shaped by engineers in labs, kids in arcades, families gathered around televisions, and creators working late into the night to bring new worlds to life. And you are part of that story every time you pick up a controller, tap a screen, or share the experience with someone else. From the first flicker on a screen to worlds built level by level, the journey continues. You're always welcome here. And remember, it's Illumentary.